The summer of 1997 in Boulder, Colorado, brought an unusual heat wave that stretched deep into August. The foothills of the Rocky Mountains, normally a refuge from the plains' oppressive temperatures, offered little relief as families sought escape in the cooler evening hours. It was during one of these sweltering nights that the Kellerman triplets, 17-year-old identical sisters Emma, Grace, and Lucy, made a decision that would haunt their family and the entire Boulder community for decades to come. The girls had always been inseparable, sharing not just their striking auburn hair and freckled complexions, but an adventurous spirit that often worried their parents, David and Margaret Kellerman. That Thursday evening, as the temperature finally began to drop from a scorching 98 degrees, the triplets announced their intention to take a night hike along the popular Chautauqua Trail, something they'd done dozens of times before during cooler months. Before we continue with this haunting story from Boulder, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Please let me know where you're watching from around the world, and don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on more mysterious disappearances like this one. Your support means everything to this channel. Margaret Kellerman would later tell investigators that she had an uneasy feeling that night, something she couldn't quite explain. The girls seemed different, more secretive, whispering among themselves in their bedroom before emerging with their hiking gear. David, a geologist with the University of Colorado, was working late in his home office, analyzing rock samples from a recent expedition. He barely looked up when the girls kissed him goodbye, their hiking boots echoing on the hardwood floors of their Victorian home near the university campus. The Chautauqua Trail system was familiar territory for the Kellerman family. They'd been hiking those paths since the girls were old enough to walk, and the triplets knew every switchback, every overlook, every hidden grove along the route. The trail they planned to take that evening was a moderate 3-mile loop that would bring them to a scenic overlook, just as the sun set behind the Continental Divide. They carried lightweight day packs, with water, granola bars, and the emergency whistle their father had insisted each of them carry since childhood. Emma, the unofficial leader despite being born only minutes before her sisters, had recently graduated as valedictorian from Boulder High School. She was planning to attend Stanford in the fall to study environmental science, following in her father's academic footsteps. Grace, artistic and introspective, had received a full scholarship to the Rhode Island School of Design, while Lucy, the most athletic of the three, was headed to the University of Vermont on a soccer scholarship. Their futures seemed as bright and limitless as the Colorado sky they loved to hike beneath. The evening of August 14th was their last planned adventure together before they would scatter across the country for college. Margaret had spent the day helping them pack, sorting through 17 years of shared memories, identical clothes, and the countless books they'd devoured together. The house felt heavy with impending change, and perhaps that's why she didn't press harder when something in her maternal instinct told her to ask the girls to stay home that night. At 6:47 p.m., according to the timestamp on the small digital camera Emma carried, the triplets were photographed at the Chautauqua Park trailhead by another hiker who recognized them from the local newspaper's academic achievement section. They appeared relaxed and happy, their identical smiles bright against the golden hour light filtering through the ponderosa pines. This would be the last confirmed sighting of Emma, Grace, and Lucy Kellerman. The girls had told their parents they expected to be home by 9 p.m., accounting for the slower pace of hiking in diminishing light and their usual tendency to linger at scenic spots, discussing everything from philosophy to their dreams for the future. When 9:30 came and went without their familiar chatter filling the house, Margaret began checking her watch every few minutes. By 10 p.m., David had abandoned his geological samples and joined his wife at the kitchen window, both of them straining to see the distant trailhead parking area from their elevated neighborhood. Boulder, in the late 1990s, was still a relatively safe place where parents allowed their teenagers considerable freedom. especially kids as responsible and experienced as the Kellerman triplets. The city's outdoor culture encouraged young people to explore the surrounding wilderness, and most families had their own collection of hiking adventures and minor scares that had ended safely. But as the clock moved past 10:30, then 11, the Kellermans knew something was wrong. David called the Boulder County Sheriff's Office at 11:15 p.m. The dispatcher, trained to handle worried parents of teenagers who stayed out past curfew, initially suggested waiting until morning before filing a formal missing persons report. But David's voice, steady and professorial even under stress, conveyed the seriousness of the situation. These weren't rebellious kids sneaking off to a party. They were experienced hikers who had never been more than a few minutes late returning from any outdoor adventure. Deputy Richard Hayes, a 15-year veteran of Boulder County law enforcement, took the initial report. He knew the Kellerman family by reputation. David's geological work had occasionally intersected with search and rescue operations in the area, and Margaret volunteered with several local environmental organizations. More importantly, Hayes knew the Chautauqua Trail system intimately. He'd hiked those paths with his own children and understood that 3 experienced local hikers didn't simply disappear on familiar terrain. The first search began at dawn on August 15th, less than 12 hours after the girls had set out for what should have been a routine evening hike. Hayes coordinated with the Rocky Mountain Rescue Group, a volunteer organization that had been conducting wilderness searches in Boulder County since 1947. Within hours, more than 40 volunteers were combing the trail system, calling the girls' names and looking for any sign of their passage. Margaret and David spent that first day in a state of suspended disbelief, providing detailed descriptions of what their daughters had been wearing, their hiking experience, and their mental state when they left the house. Emma had worn a red North Face fleece, Grace a purple one, and Lucy her lucky green sweatshirt from a high school soccer tournament. All 3 carried identical black JanSport day packs, a Christmas gift from their grandmother the previous year. The terrain around Chautauqua presented both advantages and challenges for the search teams. The well-maintained trails were easy to follow, but dozens of unofficial paths branched off into more remote areas of the foothills. Rock formations created hidden alcoves and small caves where someone could seek shelter, or where evidence might remain concealed for years. The elevation changes were significant enough that a fall could be fatal, but the girls were sure-footed hikers who had navigated much more challenging terrain during family backpacking trips. As the sun set on that first day without any trace of the triplets, the search expanded to include areas beyond the immediate trail system. Helicopters from the Colorado Army National Guard joined the effort, using thermal imaging equipment to scan the rugged terrain for any sign of the missing girls. The rhythmic chopping of rotor blades became the soundtrack to Boulder's growing anxiety, a mechanical heartbeat that promised hope while delivering only more questions. Local media coverage began on the second day, with reporters from Denver driving up to Boulder to cover what was already being called an unprecedented disappearance. The story had all the elements that captured public attention: identical triplets, a family of local prominence, and the mystery of how 3 experienced hikers could vanish without a trace in familiar terrain. The Kellerman house became a gathering point for neighbors, friends, and strangers who wanted to help in any way possible. Margaret's sister, Jennifer, arrived from Phoenix on the 3rd day of the search, finding her normally composed older sister exhausted and hollow-eyed. The 2 women had always been close, despite the distance between their homes, and Jennifer immediately recognized that Margaret was holding herself together through sheer force of will. David had transformed their dining room into a command center, with maps of the search area covering every surface and a constantly ringing telephone that brought either false hope or crushing disappointment with each call. The first potential breakthrough came on August 18th. 4 days after the disappearance. A mountain biker discovered what appeared to be fresh footprints in a muddy section of trail, approximately 2 miles from where the girls had been last seen. The prints were photographed and cast in plaster, but the analysis proved inconclusive. The size and tread pattern were consistent with the hiking boots the triplets had been wearing, but dozens of other hikers used the same trails daily, and the recent rain had made precise dating impossible. Search dogs were brought in from as far away as New Mexico, their handlers working in rotating shifts to cover the maximum amount of terrain while the scent trail remained viable. The dogs showed interest in several areas, but the hot weather and the passage of time had degraded whatever traces might have remained. Each false lead felt like a small death to the Kellerman family, hope rising and falling with each bark from the search dogs or shout from a volunteer who thought they'd spotted something significant. The psychological toll on the family became evident as the first week stretched into the second. David threw himself into organizing search efforts with the same methodical approach he brought to his geological research, but Margaret found herself unable to concentrate on anything beyond the immediate moment. She would start to prepare dinner for 5 people, then remember that only she and David would be sitting at the table. The girls' bedrooms remained exactly as they'd left them, beds unmade and college preparation materials scattered across their shared desk. Friends and colleagues from the university rallied around the Kellermans, organizing meal trains and volunteer coordination that allowed the family to focus entirely on the search efforts. Dr. Patricia Holbrook, Margaret's closest friend and colleague in the Environmental Studies Department, became an unofficial family spokesperson, handling media requests and managing the growing number of people who wanted to help. The Boulder community's response was overwhelming. Hundreds of volunteers showed up for organized searches. Local businesses donated food and supplies, and prayer vigils were held at churches throughout the area. But as August turned into September, and the initial intensive search efforts expanded into a longer-term missing persons investigation, the hard reality began to set in. The Boulder County Sheriff's Office had conducted one of the most thorough wilderness searches in the county's history, covering more than 50 square miles of rugged terrain with hundreds of volunteers, professional search teams, dogs, and aircraft. No trace of Emma, Grace, and Lucy Kellerman had been found. Detective Maria Santos was assigned to lead the criminal investigation, working under the assumption that the girls' disappearance might not be the result of a hiking accident. Santos, a 12-year veteran of the Boulder Police Department, had recently transferred to the sheriff's office and brought with her experience in missing persons cases from her time working in Denver. She approached the Kellerman case with fresh eyes, conducting detailed interviews with family members, friends, teachers, and anyone who had interacted with the triplets in the days leading up to their disappearance. What emerged from these interviews was a portrait of 3 young women on the threshold of adulthood, excited about their futures, but also dealing with the normal anxieties and pressures facing high school graduates. Emma had been working part-time at a local bookstore and had recently broken up with her boyfriend of 2 years, though friends described the split as amicable. Grace had been struggling with some depression related to leaving home for college, something she'd discussed with the school counselor but hadn't mentioned to her parents. Lucy seemed the most carefree of the 3, focused on soccer and excited about playing at the college level. The investigation revealed that the triplets had been more independent than their parents realized, though not in ways that suggested dangerous behavior. They had occasionally driven to Denver for concerts or shopping trips without telling their parents the full details of their plans, a normal teenager behavior that now took on more sinister implications. Detective Santos paid particular attention to their social circles, looking for any relationships or activities that might have put them at risk. A troubling detail emerged during interviews with their classmates. Several friends mentioned that the girls had been talking about a secret adventure in the weeks leading up to their disappearance, something special they wanted to do before leaving for college. When pressed for details, none of the friends could provide specifics, only that the triplets had seemed excited and secretive about some kind of plan they were making together. This revelation led Detective Santos to conduct a thorough search of the girls' bedroom, looking for any evidence of what this secret adventure might have involved. Hidden in Emma's jewelry box, Santos discovered a handwritten note that read, "Meeting point confirmed for Thursday night. Remember everything we discussed. This is our chance to finally know the truth. J." The note was unsigned beyond the initial J, and there was no indication of what truth the girls were seeking or who this mysterious J might be. The discovery of the note transformed the investigation. What had been treated primarily as a search and rescue operation became a potential criminal case. The Boulder County Sheriff's Office issued a public appeal for information about anyone with the initial J who might have had contact with the Kellerman triplets. They also began examining the girls' school records, looking for any mention of someone with that initial who might have represented a threat or undue influence. Margaret and David Kellerman were devastated by the implication that their daughters might have been meeting someone unknown to them, possibly someone with harmful intentions. They had trusted the girls' judgment and given them considerable freedom based on their demonstrated responsibility and maturity. The idea that this trust might have been exploited by someone with malicious intent was almost more than they could bear. The search for J led investigators down numerous false paths. There was Jonathan Martinez, a university student who had worked with Emma at the bookstore, but he had been in class during a verified evening seminar when the girls disappeared. James Harper, a family friend who had taken the triplets rock climbing several times, was in surgery at Boulder Community Hospital that entire evening, with dozens of witnesses to confirm his whereabouts. Every lead seemed to evaporate under scrutiny, leaving more questions than answers. As autumn arrived in Boulder, painting the aspen trees in brilliant gold against the backdrop of the mountains where the triplets had vanished, the intensity of the search efforts began to diminish. The initial flood of volunteers dwindled to a core group of dedicated individuals who continued to organize weekend searches, expanding into more remote areas of the foothills. The media attention shifted to other stories, though the local Boulder Daily Camera continued to run updates on the investigation and reminders for anyone with information to contact the sheriff's office. The Kellerman family's life settled into a strange new rhythm defined by absence. David returned to teaching his geology classes at the university, though colleagues noted that his usual enthusiasm for the subject seemed dimmed. Margaret took a leave of absence from her position in environmental studies, unable to concentrate on academic work while her daughters remained missing. They left the girls' college acceptance letters unopened on the kitchen counter, unable to throw them away, but unwilling to acknowledge the futures that might never be realized. Winter brought new challenges to the ongoing search efforts. Snow in the higher elevations made many areas inaccessible, and the likelihood of finding any trace evidence decreased with each passing storm. Detective Santos continued to follow up on tips and leads, but the investigation had reached the point where new information was rare and usually unproductive. The case file grew thicker with false leads, conspiracy theories, and well-meaning but ultimately useless suggestions from people who had heard about the disappearance. One of the most painful aspects of the ordeal was the gradual realization that life was continuing around them while theirs remained frozen in time. Friends and neighbors, initially careful to avoid mentioning their own children's college experiences or achievements, slowly returned to normal conversations. The community's intense focus on finding the triplets became a background concern, rather than the urgent crisis it had been in those first weeks of August. Margaret found some solace in joining other families of missing persons, connecting with parents across the country who understood the unique agony of not knowing what had happened to their children. These relationships, conducted mostly through letters and phone calls in the pre-internet era of 1997, provided both comfort and additional heartbreak as she learned about cases that had gone unresolved for years or decades. The first anniversary of the disappearance brought renewed media attention and a fresh wave of search efforts. The sheriff's office organized a comprehensive review of the case file, bringing in specialists from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation to examine all the evidence with fresh eyes. New search areas were identified based on refined analysis of where the girls might have gone, and volunteers once again combed through terrain that had been searched multiple times before. But August 14, 1998, came and went without any new discoveries. The Kellerman case joined the ranks of Colorado's unsolved mysteries, a file that remained open but inactive, waiting for new evidence that might never come. David and Margaret had to make the painful decision about whether to hold memorial services for their daughters or continue to maintain hope that they might someday return home. They chose to wait, unable to accept that their children were gone forever, without definitive proof. The impact on Boulder's hiking community was lasting and profound. Parents became more restrictive about allowing their teenagers to hike alone, even on familiar trails. The Chautauqua area, once considered completely safe for local families, now carried an undercurrent of anxiety for those who remembered the summer when 3 bright young women had simply vanished into the mountains. Trail registers, rarely used before 1997, became common as hikers and their families sought ways to document their whereabouts and intended routes. As the years passed, the Kellerman case became a touchstone for discussions about wilderness safety, but also about the limits of what could be known or controlled when it came to protecting loved ones. The triplets had done everything right. They were experienced hikers. They had informed their parents of their plans. They carried emergency equipment, and they knew the terrain. Yet they had still disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a mystery that seemed to defy rational explanation. Detective Santos, promoted to sergeant in 2001, never stopped thinking about the case. She kept copies of the case files in her home office, occasionally pulling them out to review when new forensic techniques became available or when similar cases in other jurisdictions might provide fresh insights. The note signed J remained the most tantalizing clue, but despite years of investigation, the identity of its author remained unknown. By 2005, David and Margaret had reluctantly begun to rebuild their lives around the reality that their daughters might never return. They established the Kellerman Foundation for Wilderness Safety, providing emergency communication equipment to young hikers and funding search and rescue training programs throughout Colorado. The work gave them a sense of purpose while honoring their daughter's memory, even as the question of what had happened to Emma, Grace, and Lucy remained unanswered. The Foundation's work brought the Kellermans into contact with other families affected by wilderness disappearances, and they learned that their case was far from unique. Every year, hundreds of people vanished in America's national forests and wilderness areas. Many of them experienced outdoors enthusiasts who seemed to simply disappear without explanation. Some were eventually found, usually deceased from exposure, falls, or other accidents. But others, like the Kellerman triplets, left behind no trace at all. In 2007, 10 years after the disappearance, the Boulder Daily Camera ran a comprehensive retrospective on the case, interviewing family members, investigators, and search volunteers who had been involved in the original efforts. The article generated dozens of tips from readers, but none provided new information that advanced the investigation. What struck many people was how little the mystery had dimmed over the decade. People still remembered the triplets, still wondered what had happened to them, and still hoped that someday answers might emerge. The 10th anniversary also brought a renewed search effort, organized primarily by volunteers who had been involved in the original searches. Many of these individuals had children of their own now, some approaching the age the Kellerman triplets had been when they disappeared. The personal connection to the case had only deepened over time, as parents imagined their own children in similar circumstances and wondered how they would cope with such a loss. Margaret Kellerman, now in her early 50s, had developed a kind of peaceful strength over the years that surprised people who met her. She spoke openly about her daughters, sharing memories and keeping their personalities alive in conversation rather than treating them as a tragic topic to be avoided. David had grown more quiet and introspective, channeling his analytical nature into the Foundation's work and occasionally consulting with other families dealing with similar disappearances. The couple's marriage had survived what many observers considered the ultimate test. Grief had changed them both, but it had also deepened their understanding of what truly mattered in life. They had learned to find meaning in their work with other families, in the gradual healing that came with time, and in maintaining hope even when logic suggested that hope was futile. In 2009, 12 years after the disappearance, Margaret received a phone call that would rekindle all the emotions and possibilities they had learned to manage. A construction crew working on a new housing development in Lyons, about 15 miles northwest of Boulder, had discovered what appeared to be personal items buried in a shallow depression near Rabbit Ears Creek. The items were weathered and partially decomposed, but among them was what appeared to be a backpack with a faded Jansport label. Detective Santos, now a lieutenant with the Boulder County Sheriff's Office, personally responded to the scene. The construction had been halted pending investigation of what might be a crime scene, and she carefully supervised the excavation of the area where the backpack had been found. The years had taught her to manage expectations. Too many similar discoveries had proved to be false alarms, abandoned camping gear, or items lost by other hikers years earlier. But as the backpack was carefully extracted from the soil and debris, Lieutenant Santos felt a familiar tightness in her chest that she had learned to associate with significant developments in long-dormant cases. The backpack was black, consistent with what the Kellerman triplets had been carrying, and despite its deteriorated condition, a faded name tag was still barely visible on the top pocket. In careful block letters, written in what appeared to be a teenager's handwriting, was the name Grace Kellerman. The discovery location was puzzling. Rabbit Ears Creek was not directly connected to any of the trail systems where the girls had been hiking, and it would have required either a significant deviation from their planned route or transportation by someone else to reach the area where the backpack was found. The surrounding terrain was dense forest and private property that had been largely undeveloped in 1997, making it unlikely that the girls would have wandered there on their own. Margaret and David were notified immediately, and they arrived at the scene within hours of the discovery. Seeing one of their daughter's possessions after 12 years was emotionally overwhelming, but it also provided the first tangible evidence that something definitive had happened to the girls. The backpack's contents were carefully inventoried by forensic specialists: water bottles, energy bars that had long since decomposed, and most significantly, a small spiral notebook that had somehow survived relatively intact inside a plastic bag. The notebook belonged to Grace and contained what appeared to be diary entries from the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Most of the entries were typical teenage observations about college preparations, family dynamics, and her relationships with her sisters. But the final few entries, written in the days immediately before the hike, contained references that aligned troublingly with the mysterious note that had been found in Emma's room years earlier. "Jay keeps talking about showing us something important," read one entry dated 3 days before the disappearance. "Says it will help us understand what really happened to that family back in the 80s. Emma thinks we should check it out, but I'm not sure. There's something about the way Jay talks about it that makes me nervous." Another entry from the day before they vanished was even more specific. "Decided to meet Jay at the usual spot tomorrow night. Emma convinced Lucy and me that we need to know the truth about what happened. Jay says the evidence is still there, hidden where no one would think to look. Part of me thinks this is crazy, but we've come this far. After tomorrow, we'll finally have answers to give to that poor family." The discovery of Grace's backpack and diary transformed the investigation once again. The references to that family back in the 80s sent Lieutenant Santos and her team diving into cold case files from Boulder County, looking for any incident that might connect to what the Triplets had been investigating. The mention of evidence being hidden where no one would think to look suggested that the girls might have been lured to a specific location by someone who claimed to have information about an older case. Research into Boulder County incidents from the 1980s revealed several possibilities, but one case stood out as particularly relevant. In 1984, the Morrison family, parents Robert and Linda and their 8-year-old daughter Amy, had disappeared while camping in Roosevelt National Forest, about 30 miles north of Boulder. Their campsite had been found abandoned with food still on the table and no signs of struggle. But the family was never located, despite extensive search efforts. The Morrison case had eventually been classified as a multiple homicide based on evidence that someone had been at their campsite after they disappeared, but no bodies were ever found, and no suspects were identified. The case had received significant local media coverage in the mid-1980s, and it was possible that the Kellerman triplets had become interested in trying to solve this older mystery. Lieutenant Santos contacted retired detective Frank Williams, who had been the lead investigator on the Morrison case. Williams, now in his 70s and living in Grand Junction, remembered the case vividly and was intrigued by the possible connection to the missing triplets. He agreed to review his old files and share any information that might be relevant to understanding what had happened to Emma, Grace, and Lucy. The Morrison case file revealed several details that seemed to align with the diary entries in Grace's notebook. There had been rumors at the time that someone with knowledge of the family's disappearance had been trying to sell information to reporters or private investigators. Williams had investigated several individuals who claimed to have evidence about what had happened to the Morrisons, but none had produced credible information. One name that appeared multiple times in the Morrison file was James "Jimmy" Fletcher, a local man who had claimed to have witnessed something related to the family's disappearance, but whose story had changed multiple times during questioning. Fletcher had been considered a person of interest, but never charged with anything related to the case. More importantly for the current investigation, Fletcher would have been in his early 40s in 1997, making him the right age to have potentially interacted with teenage girls interested in the Morrison case. The revelation that Jay might be Jimmy Fletcher led to an intensive search for the man's current whereabouts. Records showed that he had left Boulder County in late 1997, just months after the Kellerman triplets disappeared. He had moved frequently over the subsequent years, with addresses in Wyoming, Utah, and most recently Nevada, where he appeared to be working in construction. Las Vegas Metropolitan Police located Fletcher at a job site in Henderson, Nevada, and he was brought in for questioning about both the Morrison and Kellerman cases. Now 56 years old, Fletcher initially denied any knowledge of the missing triplets or any involvement in their disappearance. But when confronted with the diary entries that mention meeting Jay and learning about what really happened to that family back in the 80s, his demeanor changed noticeably. Under pressure from experienced interrogators, Fletcher eventually admitted that he had been in contact with the Kellerman triplets in the summer of 1997. He claimed that Emma had approached him at a local bar where he had been drinking and talking about the Morrison case, something he apparently did frequently when under the influence. According to Fletcher, Emma had been researching unsolved cases in Boulder County as part of a project she was working on before leaving for college. Fletcher's story was that he had agreed to show the girls where he believed the Morrison family's bodies were hidden, hoping to finally solve the case that had haunted the area for more than a decade. He claimed that he had genuine information about what had happened to the Morrisons and thought that helping to solve their disappearance would somehow redeem his own checkered past. The meeting on the night of August 14th, 1997, was supposed to be the culmination of several weeks of correspondence and planning. But Fletcher's account of what happened that night was vague and inconsistent. He claimed that the girls had met him at a location near the Rabbit Ears Creek area, where he had taken them to what he believed was the burial site of the Morrison family. According to Fletcher, they had been digging for evidence when something had gone wrong. He claimed not to remember the exact details, suggesting that he had been drinking heavily and that his memory of the events was impaired. Lieutenant Santos and the interrogation team recognized the signs of someone who was telling partial truths while concealing crucial details. Fletcher's story explained how Grace's backpack had ended up buried near Rabbit Ears Creek, but it didn't account for what had happened to the three girls or why he had fled Boulder County so quickly after their disappearance. The investigation team knew they needed more evidence to determine whether Fletcher was truly responsible for harming the triplets or whether he was simply a disturbed individual who had inserted himself into the case. A search warrant was obtained for the area near Rabbit Ears Creek, where Grace's backpack had been found. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, investigators began a systematic examination of the site where Fletcher claimed to have taken the girls. The work was painstaking and emotionally charged, with Margaret and David Kellerman maintaining a vigil nearby, hoping for answers but dreading what those answers might reveal. On the third day of the expanded search, cadaver dogs indicated the presence of human remains in an area about 50 yards from where the backpack had been discovered. The excavation revealed what appeared to be 3 sets of human remains, buried in a shallow grave that had been covered with rocks and debris. The bodies were severely decomposed after 14 years in the ground, but forensic anthropologists were able to determine that the remains were consistent with 3 young women of the approximate age and size of the Kellerman triplets. The discovery brought a mixture of relief and devastation to the Kellerman family. After 14 years of not knowing, they finally had confirmation of what had happened to their daughters. But the reality of their deaths was almost as difficult to process as the years of uncertainty had been. Margaret later described the moment as simultaneously the worst and most liberating experience of her life, the end of hope, but also the end of the terrible limbo that had defined their existence since 1997. Forensic examination of the remains would take several months, but preliminary analysis provided important clues about what had happened to the girls. Evidence suggested that they had died from blunt force trauma, consistent with being struck by a heavy object or falling from a significant height. There were no signs of sexual assault, which eliminated some of the more disturbing scenarios that had been considered over the years. Jimmy Fletcher, confronted with the discovery of the bodies, finally provided a more complete account of what had happened on the night of August 14th, 1997. According to his confession, he had indeed lured the girls to the remote location near Rabbit Ears Creek by promising to show them evidence related to the Morrison family disappearance. But his true intention had been to assault them and when the girls realized they were in danger and tried to flee, a struggle had ensued. Fletcher claimed that he had not intended to kill the triplets, but that Emma had struck her head on a rock during the struggle and died almost immediately. In his panic and rage, he had then killed Grace and Lucy to prevent them from identifying him as Emma's killer. He had buried their bodies in the shallow grave and taken Grace's backpack with him, intending to dispose of it elsewhere, but ultimately burying it nearby when he realized how much evidence it might contain. The confession provided the answers that had eluded investigators for 14 years, but it also raised new questions about Fletcher's involvement in the Morrison case. Under further questioning, he eventually admitted that he had killed the Morrison family in 1984 during a robbery attempt at their campsite. He had buried their bodies in a different location in the national forest, information that would finally bring closure to another family that had been waiting for answers for even longer than the Kellermans. Fletcher was charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder and ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial provided a public forum for all the grief, anger, and loss that had accumulated over the years, but it also brought a sense of justice that many observers had not expected to see. The man who had destroyed 2 families and terrorized a community for decades would spend the rest of his life behind bars. For Margaret and David Kellerman, the conclusion of the case marked the beginning of a different kind of grief, the definitive mourning that had been impossible while their daughter's fate remained unknown. They held a memorial service that was attended by hundreds of people from the Boulder community, including many of the volunteers who had searched for the girls over the years. The service celebrated the lives and potential of Emma, Grace, and Lucy, while also acknowledging the senseless tragedy that had cut those lives short. The Kellerman Foundation for Wilderness Safety continued its work with renewed purpose, focusing not just on outdoor safety education, but also on supporting families dealing with missing persons cases. Margaret and David became advocates for improved communication between law enforcement agencies and for better resources to help families navigate the complex emotional and practical challenges that come with having a missing loved one. The discovery of the triplets' remains also brought closure to the Morrison case, with Fletcher leading authorities to the burial site of Robert, Linda, and Amy Morrison in a remote area of Roosevelt National Forest. After nearly 30 years, that family could finally be laid to rest, and their surviving relatives could begin their own process of healing. The connection between the 2 cases demonstrated how violence often ripples outward in ways that affect multiple families and entire communities. Boulder's hiking community gradually healed from the trauma of the disappearances, though the case remained a sobering reminder of how quickly outdoor adventures could turn dangerous. The Chautauqua Trail system, where the girls had begun their final hike, was eventually dedicated as the Emma, Grace, and Lucy Kellerman Memorial Trail, with educational markers about wilderness safety and emergency preparedness along the route. In the years following the resolution of the case, Margaret and David found ways to honor their daughter's memory that went beyond grief and loss. Emma's interest in environmental science led them to establish a scholarship program for young women pursuing careers in earth sciences. Grace's artistic nature inspired them to support local arts education programs, while Lucy's athletic achievements led to the creation of a youth soccer league that emphasized both competition and community service. The ripple effects of the case extended far beyond Boulder, influencing missing persons investigations throughout Colorado and beyond. The importance of preserving and re-examining cold case files was reinforced, and the case became a teaching tool for law enforcement agencies dealing with similar situations. The 14-year gap between the disappearance and the discovery of the bodies demonstrated both the challenges and the importance of never giving up on finding answers for grieving families. Lieutenant Santos, who had dedicated much of her career to finding the Kellerman triplets, retired from law enforcement shortly after Fletcher's conviction. She often reflected on how the case had shaped not just her professional approach to investigations, but her understanding of how communities respond to tragedy and how families find ways to survive unimaginable loss. The case had tested everyone involved: family members, investigators, volunteers, and the broader community, and had ultimately demonstrated both human cruelty and human resilience. The story of Emma, Grace, and Lucy Kellerman became part of Boulder's collective memory, a cautionary tale about the dangers that could lurk even in familiar places, but also a testament to the power of community support and the importance of never losing hope. Their disappearance had been a mystery that haunted the foothills of Colorado for 14 years, but the eventual discovery of the truth brought a form of peace that allowed healing to begin. Today, hikers on the Memorial Trail often pause at the overlook where the triplets had planned to watch the sunset on their final evening together. The view remains as spectacular as it was in 1997, with the Continental Divide stretching endlessly toward the horizon and the lights of Boulder twinkling in the valley below. It's a place of natural beauty that has been touched by human tragedy, but also by the enduring love of a family and community that refused to forget three young women whose lives were cut short just as they were beginning to bloom. The case file of the Kellerman triplets is now closed, the mystery solved after 14 years of investigation and heartbreak. But the legacy of Emma, Grace, and Lucy lives on through the foundation that bears their name, the scholarship recipients who follow in Emma's scientific footsteps, the young artists who benefit from Grace's memorial fund, and the soccer players who embody Lucy's competitive spirit and love of teamwork. Their story, while tragic, ultimately became one of hope, community, and the triumph of truth over the darkness that had hidden their fate for so many years.